The floor is open for questions.
Thank the morning panel and the panel this afternoon, or this later in the morning, for their very interesting comments. I'm struck at looking at this whole problem. I'm reminded of Edward Lee's famous painting of a Marine in Peleliu, the 1,000-yard stare, which is what we confront when we look at Pakistan with a destabilized situation with the Taliban in power with nuclear weapons. And I'm sort of building up a little bit on Ambassador Saltzman and Richard's comments. We all know that the polls show in Afghanistan a very low popular opinion support for the Taliban. We also know that the voting in the northwest area inside Pakistan for the jihadist political parties was also very low. Yet, we have this outcome where just last week, Sufi Mohammed was on national television in Pakistan declaring that his objective is to destroy the Western constitution of Pakistan, which he considers an infidel constitution, and impose Sharia law throughout the country. And we see from SWAT that that as far south as Peshawar, or in areas further south of the SWAT area, the Taliban are further expanding their influence. So that raises a question of how accurate even our assessments are of what popular opinion really is on the ground inside the country. Secondly, the question of Hamid Karzai and the drug issue. We know that the DEA estimates that there are at least 6 to 7 drug conspiracies, if you will, in Afghanistan, including one run by Hamid Karzai's brother. And we all know from Vietnam the whole question of narcotics in the Golden Triangle area and all the problems that had. So it raises a serious issue of how counter-narcotics can really be effectively implemented if indeed the leadership that we support, parts of it are benefiting from the very same sources that finance the Taliban. And finally, the issue of the effectiveness of the Afghani military and the Pakistani military. There's a huge lack of information in the public about what really is happening down to the platoon company level in the Afghan army, their security forces, the Pakistan army, and their police forces. How effective are they? Because what are they doing? Sitting around, and this whole situation, the Fatah, has been going on since 2001. There's been journalist after journalist who've been there talking about how it's grown. So what do we really know about how effective these people are? Because I can see, frankly, that the objective of the operations is to essentially circumvent our strategy by overthrowing the government in Pakistan. And then we have a mess beyond our wildest dreams.
Jim, yeah. Can you identify yourself?
Oh, Jim Dingman.
Okay, well, let me address some pieces of it anyway. First of all, with respect to the whole question of what do we know about popular preferences, either in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, obviously this is a difficult environment for polling in lots and lots of ways. So I would suggest that whatever you think of the accuracy of polls in U.S. electioneering, it's going to be lower, either in the Fatah in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. By the same token, it would really have to be impressively bad for us to be getting the wrong sense of what the public at large in Afghanistan and Pakistan prefers. I mean, the polling results in Afghanistan are consistently under 10% voicing a preference for Taliban governance. So you'd have to have gotten the right answer wrong by a factor of 10 for us to have the wrong impression here. My guess is that we may be underestimating Taliban political support in Afghanistan, for example, but probably not by enough to overturn the robustness of a finding that's this extreme. The problem here, it seems to me, however, is that this isn't a peaceful electoral process. I mean, the fact that the Taliban are able to make progress in Afghanistan or that Islamist insurgents are able to make progress in the Fatah doesn't mean that, in fact, the people want that. This is a very violent, brutally coercive insurgency going on in both of these environments. And I would argue that the Taliban's progress in Afghanistan and Islamist insurgents' progress in Pakistan has as its primary source an inability of the government to protect civilians from insurgents who are prepared to murder people in order to realign them. So I think for a variety of reasons, although successful counterinsurgency requires political reform, economic progress, and security, security is primus inter pares in that group. And the trick is integrating all three elements. But if you do not have security, very little can be done in other domains because you're dealing with insurgents who are willing to kill in order to cause people to realign. Just briefly on the issue of counter-narcotics, you could argue that counter-narcotics is the nastiest part of a very nasty collection of interrelated problems in Afghanistan. But let me just address one little piece of it, though, which is how in the world are we going to make progress at all, or with respect to the narcotics problem in Afghanistan, when the government of Afghanistan is so directly implicated in it? This is another area in which I think Max and I probably disagree, although I'm not sure, where I think we are going to have to exert coercive leverage on the government of Afghanistan. I mean, there is a major interest divergence between ourselves and the Karzai regime with respect to acceptance of illegal narcotics activity within Afghanistan. Karzai benefits significantly from the fact that important elements of his authorizing environment are profiting enormously from the narcotics trade. Left to his own devices, he's very unlikely to take the personal political risk associated with shutting this activity down. We have to make it worth his while. We have to change his interest calculus in a way that causes him to conclude that it is in his self-interest to accept that degree of political risk because the consequences for his relationship with the United States are so potentially negative if he doesn't. My sense is that much as was the case in Iraq over the course of 2007, where the U.S. effort became substantially more coercive vis-a-vis the Maliki regime, we are also going to have to become more coercive in getting the Karzai government to move its behavior in the direction of our interests and away from the direction of the self-interest of a government that's increasingly divorced from the interests of its population. And that doesn't necessarily mean we have to publicly humiliate Karzai in major media fora. We could have a separate conversation on tactically how should one go about the business of exerting U.S. leverage to cause Karzai to change his behavior. But I think it is, in my view, it is absolutely necessary that we apply coercive leverage to require of the government of Afghanistan that they clean up their act with respect to corruption, prominently with respect to the narcotics contribution to that corruption.
So please identify yourself.
My name is Amar Fadil. I'm a second-year security policy student at SIPA. My question to Dr. Biddle and Mr. Boot, you both pointed out the advantages that the United States and NATO have in fighting the Taliban and the disadvantages of the Taliban in this war. And these are actually encouraging signs. And I hate to be cynical, but what are the chances that the Afghan government is going to be able to build up on future accomplishments by the United States forces that we hope we'll see in terms of securing the country, providing basic services, and actually being able to provide for a security force that's capable of sustaining the situation in the future? What are the resources that, how much resources can Afghanistan put in this respect? I know, for example, that Iraq has a national income and national budget of some $60 billion and is still facing a lot of problem providing services and equipping its expanding military and even in paying the salaries of the awakening consuls who were very crucial in turning the tide against al-Qaeda. Do you think that Afghanistan will be able to cope with the requirements of sustaining future accomplishments? That's if they're going to happen. Thank you.
Well, there's no question Afghanistan is desperately poor and has very little by way of economic activity on the legal side of the books right now. I don't think that's inevitable, though. And I think one of the important points to make about Afghanistan is It is not an artificial state, and it has functioned in the past. I mean, if you want to look at artificial states, Pakistan is an artificial state. Afghanistan has been around since the 18th century, and it was actually making, I would say, I mean, this is before my time, but I think it was making decent political, economic, and other progress in the 1960s and in the early 70s up through 78 and the coup and the Soviet invasion in 79 and all the rest of it. But under King Zahir Shah, I think it was actually a pretty decent place, even though it was still very poor. But I think it was, and it didn't have an incredibly strong central government, but it also didn't have all these guerrilla groups and militia groups and others running around blowing things up and killing people. So I think there's a very strong desire on the part of the people of Afghanistan to return to that kind of existence that they enjoyed before their world was destroyed by 2 decades of nonstop war. And I think you saw them in 2001 really welcoming with open arms the coalition presence and really desiring the development of a democratic type of government. And the Taliban were really sent reeling before they finally managed to make a comeback in the last couple of years. But I don't think it's by any means hard to imagine that we could get back to the kind of progress that we were making in 2002, 2003, if we can just get the security situation under control. I mean, I agree with what Steve said before, that obviously if you're going to be successful in a counterinsurgency, you have to have major political and economic aspects to your campaign plan. But the number one priority has to be security. Security is what makes everything else possible, including political and economic development. And that is really where Afghanis actually have a real entrepreneurial tradition, standing at the crossroads of many different cultures and regions, and I think could really develop a lot of that economic activity if the political and governmental conditions were more conducive to that. Now, I think there's a lot we can do about the security conditions. That's the area where luckily, that's the number one problem, I think, and that's the number one area where we can have the greatest impact the fastest, because based on our experience in Iraq and other places, we certainly know how to impose security if we put sufficient resources into it. Now, standing up, honest, efficient government is much tougher, and that's something that Dick Betts alluded to, many others have alluded to as well, and we don't necessarily have a great track record of doing that. It's very hard to do, but I think it is possible to do. I think some of the things that, as I said before, some of the things that we're doing are counterproductive to that, and publicly running down the elected head of the Afghan government is not going to help him to exert his authority. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about scapegoating our political leaders that we're allied with. There's a tendency in American wars, when things are going badly, we blame somebody else. And in Vietnam, we blamed Diem. So we got rid of Diem, and the situation actually became worse. In the case of Iraq, we went through a number of prime ministers, each of whom we blamed for the problems and for not miraculously fixing things. And even Maliki, we were very unhappy with through 2007, basically saying, why isn't this guy doing a better job? Well, we saw what happened in Iraq, which was that as we got the insurgency under control, all of a sudden the prime minister was able to exert his authority in a way that hadn't been possible before, and he was able to do things that really astonished and surprised us in a good way, such as going down to Basra and kicking the butts of the Jaish al-Mahdi, or into Basra, into Sadr City, taking actions that we've been urging him to, or wanted him to do for a long time, but he never had the guts to do because he didn't really have the power to do. But if you can empower the government by enhancing security and by enhancing governmental capacity, you may be surprised at what political leaders are willing to do. And in fact, now it's kind of amusing to me the way we go back and forth on this, because, now we're bashing Karzai, and it wasn't too long ago that he was seen as a model Democrat. We were bemoaning the fact that in Iraq we didn't have any guy as good as Karzai. Karzai is not, I don't think, is a bad guy. He's a political leader, and like a lot of political leaders, he's not always a profile in courage. But if given the right encouragement and the right incentives, I think he can be brought around to do the right things. I think that's something that when Zal Khalilzad was the U.S. ambassador there up through 2005, he was pretty good about embracing Karzai, hugging him tight, and also giving him a little shove, to deal with warlords and some of these other problems. And we've really been lacking somebody who could do that kind of approach. We haven't had a strong ambassador to do that kind of pushing and supporting of the leadership in Afghanistan. And that's something I think we really have to develop instead of just venting our frustration with the guy in public.
Yes, please.
I'm Iman Rizwan, first year MIA ISP at SEPA. My question is about the Durand line. There has been a huge deployment along the line, and some 80,000 Pakistani troops have been deployed there. With 800 checkpoints, the border still remains very dangerous and porous. So do you think that there is a dire need to declare this imaginary line into an international border where you can implement the legitimate international border laws? And in the light of PAC-AF framework, what is the weightage of this area in order to achieve a stable Pakistan and Afghanistan? Thank you.
Well, just with respect to the Durand line, I suspect that the problem here is not so much legal as it is primarily military and secondarily political. Even if this line were internationally recognized, the problem is there is not a sufficient density of security force assets there, given the complexity of this terrain, to close infiltration routes. I don't think that would change if its legal status changed. Perhaps more importantly, the underlying problem is that there is sufficient a sufficient local base of political support for insurgency on either side of that line that insurgent organizations are able to organize, equip, refit, retrain, and provide, therefore, a base of resources to infiltrate across that line. Some combination of, if you like, nation building, if you prefer classical counterinsurgency, with interdiction effort along the border will be necessary if this cross-border flow is ever going to stop. I don't think the primary constraint in that process, however, is legal.
Identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Sean Gralton. I've got 2 years of experience in Afghanistan, and I'm also working with the U.S. Army right now as a counterinsurgency trainer. My question is this, or my concern is this, I guess. I see far too much focus on the military side of things here, and there has been some discussion during the questions about how do we build up democracy, how do we build up the economy there. What I am concerned about is that we're focusing far too much on the security side of the equation. It is absolutely the requirement that we have security in order to do any of the other development work, but if we focus entirely on security and lose track of what's going on in governance and in the economy, it doesn't matter how well we do security. We're not going to win the war. What can we do to improve the performance on the ground in our governance, in the governance area, as well as in the economic area? What I've seen myself in Afghanistan over the past few years is a dysfunctional aid system which focuses on outsourcing every job to contractors who obviously have overhead and profits to take care of. They have to answer to 2 or 3 different masters, their own bureaucracies at home, USAID, as well as their beneficiaries. I don't see any discussions of how we can improve what is probably a spaghetti, an organogram that's probably even more of a spaghetti bowl than the NATO command structure you've described. So I'd like to hear what your ideas are on that. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers.
Well, I mean, I think, I think judging from our comments that Steve and I are in basic agreement here, which is that, I don't want to speak for you, I'll let you speak for yourself, but I'm in basic agreement with myself here that that you certainly do have to have, different lines of operation to be successful in a counterinsurgency strategy. And as you suggested, the development lines of operation in democracy and state building, all those things, economic activity, we're not nearly as good at that as we are at the security side of the equation. And there's no question about that. I don't think anybody has been all that great in terms of doing state building overnight. It's not an overnight process. It takes decades. But I think what you do basically, if you can get the, I don't think, we shouldn't paralyze ourselves about this, because I think there was a lot of the same concerns raised in Iraq, and a lot of people were saying in 2006 and 2007, can we possibly turn around the security situation without having better governance capacity to begin with? And I think, yes, it's vitally important that over the long run, if Iraq or Afghanistan is going to develop the way we'd like them to develop, they have to build up better governance capacity with more effective and government that actually functions and delivers things for people, street lights and clean water and roads and stuff like that. But That's, a very difficult long-term process. The immediate priority is to get the security situation under control. And if you get the security situation under control, you make the governance tasks and the economic development tasks much, much easier. Whereas, as we found in the case of Iraq, if you try to do development without a stable security environment, you basically wind up losing and wasting $20 billion. There's just no way to do these projects if there's not a basic level of law and order which exists, which allows people to go about their business. So I think, we need to do more on the governance and economic development sides. There's no question about it. I think the Obama administration has recognized that. They've talked about doing a civilian surge, which, of course, as usual, turns out to be actually a surge of Army reservists because there aren't enough civilians. And I think long-term, the long-term answer here is we need to build up our capacity within the U.S. government to do this kind of thing. I mean, as you know, I'm sure, USAID has been absolutely destroyed over the course of the last several decades. I mean, they used to have more AID officers in South Vietnam alone than they have around the entire world today. They become a contract organization. I think we really need to build up AID once again to become kind of our nation-building agency, if you like, our version of the British Colonial Office under a different name. That's the long-term strategy. I think we got to pursue that so we have the real resources to address that side of it. But in the meantime, I think we got to do what we can with what we have, and I think we will make real progress, even if we just focus primarily right now on the security side, because I think that's where the potential for disaster exists, and we got to be able to, kind of stabilize the patient before nursing them back to full health.
Just to add one or two wrinkles to that, I think there's universal agreement that we need more political reform and economic development. With the rare exception of the occasional Ralph Peters, 99.9% I submit of the national security community will agree with you on that. So the interesting question, it seems to me, is not whether it's a good idea, but how in the world do you do it given the structure of the U.S. government at the moment, which is not designed to be conducive to a deployable, expeditionary economic and political development activity led by the Department of State or other civilian agencies. For a variety of reasons, political and administrative, we have organized the civilian parts of the government differently that makes it essentially impossible for them to do that in the short term. Now, one solution to this problem is radically re-engineer the civilian agencies of the executive branch to enable them to do this. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for doing that. There's been a great cottage industry around Washington in Goldwater Nichols 2, Goldwater Nichols 3, Goldwater Nichols 17, lots of proposals for how to redesign the civilian parts of the government to enable them to provide that contribution to counterinsurgency, whether in Iraq or in Afghanistan. I'm skeptical that will happen, in part because one of the contributing causes to the conditions we're in now is that the prospects for funding these activities politically on Capitol Hill are not very good. For a variety of reasons we could talk about, the military has been much more successful in commanding resources than the State Department has been. I think that's unlikely to change radically in the near term. Therefore, what this issue boils down to at the end of the day is, do you want the military to do this, or do you not want it done? The military is an imperfect instrument for doing this in a variety of ways, but I think the meaningful question in the time scales that matter for Afghanistan and Iraq is, do we or do we not want the military redirecting its own resources in this way? And I think the military has essentially decided to do that. And for my money, I think that's the right way to go. It's not the preferred way to do it, but I think it's probably the only realistic way to do it. Not that efforts to reform the civilian side aren't a good idea and shouldn't be pursued. I'm just skeptical that at the end of the day there will be sufficient change soon enough to matter.
I would just say one thing. I would say the biggest problem I think that we have with the military building is that they tend to, by nature, focus on the security side of what's going on, the shooting, the kinetic activity. So it makes it fundamentally difficult. Yes, I understand.
Dana.
Great. Thanks. I have a question and a comment. I'm going to give the comment first because it's directly related to this discussion. I've been working in Afghanistan since 2005. I started studying aid to education in Afghanistan. I've just completed a large-scale randomized trial of community-based schools in remote Afghan villages, and we find that these schools work. We actually find that they eliminate gender disparity at the primary level. That means girls in these villages are going to school. They wouldn't be going if these schools weren't there. This is evidence-based research. It's research that it's evidence from a USAID-funded project carried out by a consortium of international NGOs. The consortium consisted of CARE, CRS, IRC, Aga Khan. It's called PACE-A. It was funded for $24 million over 5 years. These types of programs should not be thrown out with the rest of the bad aid. There's been a lot of bad aid. There's a lot of problems with aid to Afghanistan. People have already mentioned contractors and the reporting problems that arise. But there are programs that work. I have never been a strong advocate for USAID, but I do want us to focus on those evidence, the results that we have and the programs that we know that work. That's one of them. That's my first comment. My question is unrelated, actually. Steve, I appreciated your characterization of the Taliban's advantages, that they lack unity, that they have an ideology that's not supported by the population, and that they're ethnically constrained, and I agree with you on all points. But they have one advantage, and that's in the media. They've been winning the war of words. So my question is, the U.S. has a big PR problem. U.S. and NATO have a big PR problem in Afghanistan. It's civilian casualties. And the U.S. and NATO are losing the war of words in Afghanistan. There's an excellent ICG report that was written. It came out in July for those who are interested in reading more about it. My question is, why are the U.S. and NATO losing the war of words? Why aren't they thinking about cell phones that work incredibly well in Afghanistan? Across the country, Taliban tried to destroy cell phone towers, were thwarted by the population because cell phones are so important, and it was such an unpopular move. So my question to you is, how could it be that this ragtag group can master the media that U.S. and NATO don't seem to be able to do? Thanks.
Well, let me start by agreeing with part, and then I'll respond to other elements. I am absolutely in favor of radically increased aid expenditure in Afghanistan, and in its much more efficient direction than has often been the case. The ratio of good aid to bad aid has been too small. I'm just pessimistic, much as I would like it to be the case, that we're going to see the kinds of organizational changes at state and at USAID that we would like. And for that reason, I think we probably have to make do with second best, which includes things like NGO activities. I mean, ideally, I would prefer to have this be an integrated activity of a joint military-civilian command in Afghanistan. I think we're probably stuck with solutions that are a good deal less integrated than that. But that doesn't say we shouldn't do them. We should. And with respect to the war of words and the information war in Afghanistan, and let me start with this question of cell phones. There is tremendous fascination on the part of the military I.O. or information operations specialty group and things like that. And bless their hearts, I'm in favor of them working that side of this, essentially, if you like, the tactical level, finding the right modalities for getting the message out, getting the message written into Pashto, having people who actually know something about the Pashtun community, figuring out what the content should be. I think all those things are good to do, and we should do more of them. And there is substantial interest in the part of the military and U.S. government in doing a lot more of that. I think there's a deeper problem, though, which is that there's a whole question of getting the message out and messaging and all that. There's an underlying problem, however, of are we or are we not providing the security needed and structuring the conflict in such a way that at the end of the day people are going to decide that our message is more appealing than theirs in a way that matters. I suspect, for example, that at the end of the day, no matter how we send out messages, if people in a village believe that if they tip off the government or the Americans to the presence of Taliban, they'll be visited at 2 a.m. by a team of thugs and their family will be killed, whether we're sending out text messages to their cell phones is going to be secondary. So we need to do that, and we need to do it right. But the underlying question, it seems to me, is can we provide the security integrated properly with economic development and political change that will enable people to take action in response to the things that the messages that we're sending to them. So point number one is I think the underlying security condition is necessary for any of the rest of this to work very well. And our central problem at the moment is too much of the country is insecure to the point where, you know, whatever our message is, people don't feel comfortable acting on it. The second problem, though, and related, is that we tend to think of information operations as an overlay on a military campaign. Better would be if it's integrated. One of the reasons why the Taliban, and to some extent insurgent groups in Iraq, have been so successful, and this is a bit of a cliche, but we tend to think about conducting a military operation and then conducting an information operations campaign to publicize its results. Our enemies tend to think about what message they want to send, and then they design a military action to send that message. And that tends to be more successful, by and large. And it needn't necessarily be a monopoly of our opponents. I mean, for example, Dave Kilcullen, wonderful counterinsurgency theorist, I'd say great American, but he's an Australian.
He's becoming a citizen.
Well, you never know with Dave exactly whether it's time to say he's a great Australian or he's a great American. But he describes a rather different model for the conduct of military operations in Kunar province in Afghanistan that integrates the information operations, the economic development, and the conduct of military actions on the ground in a way that sends a very different message. If I tell you the whole anecdote, I'll get into big time trouble given the number of people lined up at the microphone, but I commend to you his book, Accidental Guerrillas, which tells this anecdote in great detail. And the bottom line of it is military operations designed the way he advocates have the effect of structuring the fight with Americans defending Afghans, Taliban attacking Afghans, and the message that gets sent out is much, much easier that way because the underlying structure of the fight is designed for an information purpose. It's designed to put us on the right side, put them on the wrong side, and set up a story that's easier to tell because it speaks more directly to the underlying concerns of the audience.
Can I just add one quick point here, which is part of the problem in Afghanistan has been with collateral damage. A big part of the problem has been with collateral damage, which the enemy has taken very skillful advantage of in their I.O. campaign. But a lot of the reason for that is because we have not had enough troops on the ground. We've been trying to pursue in many ways this kind of long-range counterterrorist strategy where we call in long-range fire from artillery, mortars, usually aircraft, and we don't necessarily have people in close contact with the enemy, so the fire is not very exact, and so we wind up blowing up a wedding party or something like that. As we get more troops on the ground, there will be an initial surge of casualties on all sides, but I think that you will see a decline in collateral damage or in civilian casualties as a percentage of the whole, because I think we will be much more exact in our we'll be able to be much more pinpoint in our targeting. And just as important, we're going to have much better contacts with the communities because a lot of what we need to do, and we haven't been able to do fully, is to have good relations with the elders in the local area, both before, during, and after the kinetic operation. And as we do that, I think we will be able to soothe over some of the problems that have been caused by errant bombs and some of these other difficulties. So, yeah, it's been a huge problem, but I think part of it is just, again, comes down to lack of resources.
That's true in some respects, but I think you need to qualify it. I think the notion that collateral damage is always much lower in ground operations as opposed to air operations is not consistent, especially if you allow artillery to be used in normal ways. So I think the substitutability of ground power for air power as a way of reducing civilian casualties is limited.
Well, in the immediate sense, I don't think there's a big trade-off between ground and air forces in that way. But I think there's an important difference in that the ground force approach can work. If it works, the war ends, and that reduces collateral damage dramatically. The problem with insufficient troop density in a counterinsurgency environment is it puts you in a position of ineffectively and unsuccessfully substituting remote firepower for tactically defensive security presence on the ground. And what that does is it just produces an ongoing failure that continues the fighting and causes ongoing collateral damage. And so I think the issue is do the thing that works and that actually secures the area. That shuts down military activities there at some point, and that's what eventually reduces collateral damage.
Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to ask all three questioners to ask your questions, and then the panelists will respond to the group.
I'm Kimberly Martin. I was on the first panel. My question is primarily directed to Max Boot, but I welcome answers from anybody. I think the sense is not only among the Obama administration, but among the senior officers who are leading the U.S. counterinsurgency campaign, that the Afghan government is broken. And it's not just Karzai, it's the entire government that is completely penetrated with the drug trade. And therefore, people are turning to the local level, the district level, the governor level, as you mentioned. The problem is that a lot of the people at the district level and the governor level are not all good guys. Some of them are bad guys, too. Not even primarily maybe in relationship to the Taliban, but in relationship to being very penetrated by the international drug trade. So the question is, if we try to build governance at a local level as an alternative to the central government because everything is broken, what do we do after U.S. troops leave? And therefore, we are reliant on local corrupt officials for security in this crucial part of the world.
Yes, go ahead, your question.
You're going to get all three?
All three.
My first comment is very brief. I think this should have been what can we do to help the Afghans win the war, not what the West can do, because that changed your whole perspective. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, and I'd like some comment on, are the upcoming elections. There's every evidence so far that Karzai is going to run a pretty corrupt campaign. I think we're going to try to level the playing field. And hopefully we'll do that not with a lot of public bombast, but with some very effective interference locally. But I think that if, in fact, the elections turn out to be corrupt, not only will it dishearten the Afghans, but it will have a tremendous effect here at home and affect this whole question of whether we can stay the course. So I'd like some comments.
I'm Bob Jervis from the Saltzman Institute at Columbia. My question is about the political aspect, but not state building, but the closer to the counterinsurgency, which are the prospects and strategies for splitting the Taliban. And I completely agree with Stephen who said, the Taliban isn't, it isn't a unity. There are lots of different groups. Is it possible to separate out the more, quote, moderate or ones whose objectives are less far-reaching? Alternatively, there was just a small squib by Barney Rubin in a book review I just read the other day that argued that really wouldn't be possible. And he argued, really just stated, because he didn't have space to develop it, Taliban was really fairly centralized and that, in fact, to win the war, we had to make a deal, but the deals would have to be with sort of the top leadership of Taliban rather than the local level. So the twofold is sort of, is there any, does this part of the politics work? And if so, what's the target, sort of at the grassroots, so to speak, of Taliban or at the higher levels of the organization?
I think it's very possible to split the Taliban and break them apart, but not right now, because basically you have to generate momentum on the ground before you will see elements within the insurgency cutting deals with you. I mean, you saw that certainly happen in 2001, 2002, when we were effective in Afghanistan. All of a sudden there were huge desertions from the Taliban. In fact, a lot of people who are in the government today, including Karzai at one point were associated with the Taliban in the past and then switched sides. And I think it's very possible to do that in the case of Afghanistan, just as we did, by the way, in Iraq. But in Iraq also we saw that the idea of talking with the enemy was not going to be successful until the enemy started becoming convinced they were going to lose. At that point, that creates big incentives for the sons of Iraq, for example, to switch sides and come over to your side, but they're not going to come over to your side if your side looks like it's losing. And in the case of Afghanistan, our side has looked like the losing side up until now. If we can change the momentum on the battlefield, all of a sudden you will see this great mass, I think, of tribal society, which is very pragmatic and opportunistic, flipping over to our side. But you got to make the gains first, and not the notion that you can somehow sweet talk the Taliban into coming over to your side right now. That ain't going to happen. Let me just address very briefly the other points. I mean, I think it's vitally important that the election, which is going to happen, I guess, in August, has to be seen as credible and not corrupt. That doesn't mean, however, that it's important that Hamid Karzai not win the election. I mean, I don't think we can pick a candidate in the election, and I don't think we can do that successfully. I mean, we could do it, but then I suspect we would not necessarily be happy with the results, because we would be, to some extent, undermining Afghan democracy, and more important, we would probably be getting ourselves somebody who would not necessarily be more effective than the current guy is. I mean, these are very deep systemic problems, and I think our commitment has to be to fair elections which are seen as being credible. Now, there is an issue there, because I think, there are some people, a lot of people in Afghanistan who will think that any election that Karzai wins is not fair, that somehow he won it unfairly. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think he still has a fair amount of popularity despite corruption scandals and all the rest of it. But, I think we have to work with the UN on this one and make sure that the electoral process is above board, whatever the actual outcome is. And the point that Kimberly raised about the Afghan government being broken, I think is accurate, although, it really hasn't worked in several decades, so I'm not even sure broken is the right word. But it really needs to be built up, and I think there's a lot more we need to do. I think on all phases of it, we have been. You're right that I think we've been trying to emphasize a little bit more provincial and district level governance, but I think we also need to do more at the national level. I mean, we need to do all those different approaches. We need to have. In the way we have embedded mentoring teams with Afghan National Army units, we need to have embedded mentoring teams with governors and district leaders and with cabinet ministers and with other Afghan political leaders to give them the kind of support they need, even assuming that they have goodwill. But then if you have people who are close to them, you're also able to judge better whether their will is good or not, and you can figure out which ones you want to nudge out, which ones you want to support. We do that already anyway to a large extent, but I think we could be more effective by making a bigger commitment to those different levels of governance. And that is something I think that the administration has realized they need to do and will work on.
Well, with respect to splitting the Taliban, I agree with Max on the timing of this. It clearly, you're not going to be able to persuade people to take huge personal risks in realignment in order to side with what looks to be the losing side in the war. That's just asking them to postpone the noose rather than taking it sooner. But there's been a lot of debate about how to go about the process of trying to split the Taliban. This debate between leadership and low-level foot soldiers has been prominent. It's important, though, to keep in mind what one means when one says leadership and foot soldiers. One proposal in this debate has been, and again, at some risk of alienating a great Australian, one perspective on this is most Afghans are accidental guerrillas. The Taliban's support in Afghanistan isn't ideological warriors. It's folks who are bored, hostile to foreigners, and need money. So they're low-hanging fruit. Let's hive them off from the Taliban by giving them a purpose, by making them local militia, giving them money in the form of a salary, and then they'll switch sides, as opposed to trying to negotiate with leaders who have a variety of other incentives. My concern with this program has to do with, at the end of the day, balance of security concerns in areas that we don't really control. If we had enough local security forces in a village to protect people that we were going to pay a stipend to side with us, we wouldn't need to pay them a stipend to side with us. This problem would already be solved. If local conditions are insecure enough that we're interested in paying them the stipend, the trouble is the Taliban will shoot people. The idea that we can buy them off with a few $100s a month in exchange for without a U.S. military presence and without a formal government military presence, when the Taliban can return at 2 a.m. some night, I think is unrealistic. I think there are a variety of aspects of what is euphemistically being referred to in theater as tribal outreach that I think are problematic in light of, A, the difficult security conditions in most of the country where we don't have enough presence, and B, the whole structure of local political legitimacy as it exists in 2009 as opposed to the way it existed 15, 20 years ago. I mean, a lot of the logic, and I'm now going to go slightly beyond the issues you raised in the question because I have an excuse to do so. One of the central logics in the tribal outreach initiative in Afghanistan is the central government lacks legitimacy. It's this strange foreign graft onto a basic political structure in which legitimacy is very local and inheres in Pashtun and other tribal processes in which the elders run the community in a way that seemed to fit the needs of the residents of that community. Why don't we stop trying to insert this very foreign governance system into a very different society? Let's work with the legitimacy structures that are there. Therefore, we will raise local forces under the control of local tribal elders because that actually is seen as legitimate on the part of the population. The problem is that legitimacy structure has been under attack for 20 years. I mean, the Taliban saw it as a competing source of allegiance, legitimacy, and governance at the local level, and so they've gradually been weakening it through processes including assassination. The idea that at this point in 2009, there is enough local legitimacy in these communities under the degree of security pressure that they're under from very brutal, very lethal actors in the form of the Taliban, I'm very skeptical about. I think there is serious danger that an approach that would have made sense 20 years ago now runs the risk of creating an uncontrolled local security dynamic that might lead us in directions that we're not interested in going in. And I think the analogy to Iraq here is a very weak one. Another part of the logic behind tribal outreach in Afghanistan is it worked like gangbusters in Iraq. Sons of Iraq groups have over 100,000 members, over 200 groups. Let's go do this in Afghanistan. The dynamic of bottom-up security in Iraq was fundamentally about the previous enemy changing sides and becoming the Sons of Iraq. The dynamic in Afghanistan will be we are going to take currently non-aligned local civilians and try and stand them up as militias where the enemy remains in the field and fighting. The whole logic of standing up, I don't like the local militia term for a variety of reasons, but if we want to call it that, the whole logic of standing up a local militia in Afghanistan is radically different than the way it worked itself out in Iraq over the course of 2007 in ways that I think make it very unlikely that we would get a similarly happy outcome in Afghanistan. I think if splitting the Taliban is what we want to do, the right level is, for lack of a better term, kind of middle management. You're probably not going to persuade Mullah Omar to change sides, but individual faction leadership, I think, is where the plausible way forward lies there. I don't think it's at the grassroots level. Just a brief word with respect to the issue of we should do what we can to help the Afghans win the war. As far as it goes, I think that's exactly right, and that's also orthodox classical coin doctrine. That's exactly current strategy for this theater. I think we need to take account, however, of some unique features of this theater that may make that problematic in the specifics of Afghanistan. Ideally, it would be great to build up a 300,000 to 500,000 Afghan national security force and let them conduct the counterinsurgency once they are in existence and are properly trained. I am very concerned that any plausible Afghan government is going to be able to sustain that size of security instrument. If you take Afghanistan's current GDP, optimistically credit it with 10% growth per annum for 10 years, you still end up with a feasible allocation of GDP to national security that will not support even a 300,000 security force provider instrument, much less 500,000 to 600,000. While the fighting is going on, I'm prepared to believe that we could underwrite this force financially, and that would be a fine thing to do as far as that goes. The trouble is, what if it works? If it actually succeeds and we build up an Afghan security force of sufficient size to pacify the country and the war ends, the willingness of Westerners to pay the bill for a security force whose financial requirements would dwarf our current financial aid budget to Israel or Egypt, I think is hard to see.
One problem at a time.
Well, but you then run the risk of creating a self-defeating prophecy, solving the immediate problem in a way that creates another one just as big immediately after its solution. I'm sympathetic to the need to stop the bleeding in counterinsurgency campaigns, and I was a big advocate of bottom-up stabilization in Iraq and remain so. I'm very concerned, however, that this particular approach to Afghanistan is not the only conceivable approach that might succeed, and it's one that runs the risk of undermining the national security interests we have in the conflict as soon as it apparently secures them.
Dick, do you have a parting shot?
No.
Well, thanks to the audience for lively questions, to the panel for well-informed answers, and to Ingrid Gerstmann and the staff for setting this up.